Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Building the Total Value Proposal Budget. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tammy Tilsey, and I'm the director of the Grant Hub team here at Foundant Technologies, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. As we get started, I have just a couple of announcements. Everybody always asks these questions. The webinar is planned for 60 minutes, and we are recording it. So we'll send out an email containing the link to the recording just as soon as we're done and get a chance to process that. So give us a few hours, but you should see that email later this afternoon or early tomorrow, and you can review the content. We'll also put a link to the slides and the worksheets in that email as well. So that is the most common question. The next, I want to make you aware of the elements of the GoToWebinar console. Hopefully you've utilized GoToWebinar before, but if you haven't, there's a little orange arrow that you could use to collapse and expand your controls. That'll allow you to see the whole screen. And we have lots to show you, so you'll want to see the whole screen. And if you have questions, please type them into the question box on your console. We are not going to be using the raise your hand or other methods. We have a lot of people on today's webinar. It's a record attendance. So we're excited about that. And in order to effectively and efficiently answer your questions, type them into the question box there. If this is the first Foundant-sponsored educational webinar you've attended, thank you for joining us. We do these webinars about once a month, and we bring on a special guest, and today we have Maren Bass, and we like to give an educational topic that is of value to you, and we work together with the speaker to sponsor that and bring it at no charge. So the agenda is simple. We'll tell you who Foundant is and why we do these webinars, and then turn the time over to our guest speaker. So to start, Foundant's mission is to maximize the impact of the philanthropic community, and these webinars are one way that we contribute to the sector. We provide software for different groups of grant makers, grant seekers, community foundations, and those organizations that give scholarships. They help simplify and improve the granting process. And so with Grant Hub, this is the team here that is sponsoring this. We have a solution that helps grant seekers and grant consultants plan who they're going to approach for funding, manage their funders, submit and create proposals, and manage their deadlines and report on their impact. So that is what we do. If you're ever in the market to upgrade from a spreadsheet or something else, and you need help tracking your funders and deadlines, we hope you look at us. But enough of that. This is a kind of just the architecture of Grant Hub, how we do those different items. But let's jump right in to meeting our guest speaker. Today, we're delighted to have Maren Bass join us today. Over her 20-plus year career in nonprofit world, Maren has filled a lot of shoes. She's been not only an on-staff program developer and grant writer, she's also been an independent grant consultant, a grants project manager, a grants trainer, grants reviewer, author, speaker, mentor, coach, and yes, for the past 9 years, she's even been on the grant making side. So she has a lot of perspectives to share with us as she talks about this topic. Maren has created Grants Magic U to make her extensive knowledge available to anyone, anytime, anywhere. And as we see, she's a certified trainer through GPA, Grant Professionals Association, and her sessions are applicable for CFRE and GPC credits, continuing education credits. So Maren, let me pass the controls over to you.
All right, I look for that. Hold on 1 second and we will start the broadcast. And ta-da, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Yay! All right, we are ready to go. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am so excited to be here with you today. We have a jam-packed hour ahead. I promise you, you won't want to miss a single minute of it. And I'm going to be talking pretty quickly because we have a ton of material to cover all around the topic, building the total value proposal budget, a step-by-step framework for thinking differently about what it takes to do the work we do. It always starts with mission. Everything we teach at Grants Magic U always starts with our mission. A mission-centered budget. Let's just get real clarity about where we're going with our conversation about budget. A mission-centered budget for our nonprofit, for our projects, for our proposals provides an honest, complete, and clear picture of the total value of all the resources it takes to do the work we plan to do and do it successfully. So our focus today is not to teach you everything you ever needed to know about budgets, period, but to really understand and practice taking a total value approach to budget building to clearly and compellingly show the total value of everything it takes to do our very important mission-driven work successfully. And along the way, what we're going to be doing over the hour that we have together, we're going to work with a real-life scenario and visit the major budget categories. And we're going to look at the key total value issues and challenges that you can expect to run into in each one. And you're going to learn how the total value perspective that I'm going to be unpacking for you here clears away a lot of the confusion that we all seem to have around such tricky budgeting topics as valuing volunteer time, accounting for match in our project budgets, how do we handle indirect costs, and a lot of other perennially perplexing budget issues. So those are some big promises I have for you, and I know you're going to have questions. What I'd like to ask you to do, again, we're not going to be setting out to address everything that everybody ever needed to know about budgeting. We're really going to be focusing on how to think about budgeting differently through this specific framework. So please hang on to your questions until close to the end of our program. Make a note of them, jot them down to yourself, and then you're going to use that questions box. You've got a question tab in your control box, and you're going to use that questions box to put the questions in. We're going to take as many of them as we can at the end of our topic here, and we'll stay on the line a little extra beyond the hour if we need to do that. I would really ask that you focus on keeping your questions specific to the framework and the materials that we're covering today. Again, so much that we could be teaching about budgeting outside this particular framework. So let's keep our questions focused on the framework that we're working on today. And Tammy had the great idea that if your questions don't get answered here, you can email me directly at support@grantsmagic.org. And Tammy's going to be sharing other questions with me as well. And I'll figure out a way to develop an FAQ document or video blog or something that Grant Hub will be able to post, so you'll be able to get all your questions answered, or most of them. And another thing I'd love to ask you to do, I would love for you to consider joining the Grants Magic U community. It's simple, it's free, and we have lots of vehicles inside the community for answering all kinds of questions going forward. I just wrapped up our monthly Q&A call, for instance, where we just address all kinds of issues that people are experiencing in their work in the grants world. So this is something I would love to invite you to consider doing to help you get all the answers that you need to help you move forward successfully. With that in mind, I have some questions to start off with you. That's Dr. Einstein. He's going to help us with what do you know? A couple of warm-up questions. How would you answer these questions now at the beginning of this session? Take a look at this one. Because they don't involve actual expenditures of grant dollars, in-kind contributions and volunteer services have no place in your proposal budgets. What do you think about that? True or false? Go ahead and jot down your answer to that. See what you think. How about this one, number 2? Oops, we're supposed to be doing number 2. For some reason, that didn't advance. Oh, let's see here. For some reason, my slides aren't advancing, Tammy. Oh, there we go. Phew. Number 2, because few funders allow their grant dollars to be used to cover indirect costs, it makes more sense to leave indirect costs out of your project budget planning. What do you think about that? True or false? And then how about this one? The best format to use when planning the budget for a specific grant proposal is the budget form provided by the grant maker. True or false? What do you think? Well, we're going to go ahead and move through our material, and in that process, we're going to be looking at the answers to these questions, and we'll come back at the very end of the hour and see how your answers at the end match up with the answers that you have going right now. There may be some big surprises ahead for you on some of these things. Total value. So we call this the total value budget. I just want to warm us up to make sure we understand how important thinking total value when we're putting our budgets together really, really matters. And again, this is an introductory slide. We're going to be covering each of these bullet points more deeply going forward. You're going to understand why total value is what funders call match. You can think of it as the down payment, if you will, on the investment that you're asking the funders to make in your project. Total value shows the actual accurate balance between direct and indirect costs. Oh my gosh, this is such an important point, and I can't wait to get to the slide later on in the presentation where we see how making sure that we are building total value into our budget thinking actually dramatically changes the ratio of direct and indirect costs in our organization and in our financial statements as well. A total value budget shows everything it takes to do our work in the community, and it builds an accurate picture of the tremendous economic power that the nonprofit sector has in our society as a whole. It really does matter. So a little bit more context before we start to talk about the specifics of what total value means. Let's take a look at where the budget fits. This is what I call the bottom-up logic model. You might notice that the headings on these boxes match with your typical logic model headings progressing left to right in a horizontal way. Well, we flipped that logic model on its side so that what we're actually seeing is how that resources line at the bottom supports absolutely everything that your organization is doing around a particular project or initiative that you're supporting. The resources, the budget is the resource plan that is the foundation of everything that you're intending to do and the changes, the outcome, the impact that you're intending to see. So this is not an add-on by any means. It is the foundation of all the work we do. Excuse me. I need to take a drink. I did that Q&A earlier and my voice is a little bit weak right now. And I want to also start before we dive into the total value budget, thinking of making sure that we understand what the hierarchy of budgets looks like in our organization, and we're really clear about what level we're looking at here today. So the top line, let's just take a hypothetical organization called Youth Play Community Theater. They're actually going to feature in our real life scenario a little bit later on. So that top line represents the annual organizational budget. That's the budget that covers absolutely everything that Youth Play Community Theater does all year long. And maybe as a community theater, they have three programs, three initiatives that pretty much remain the same from year to year. And these have to do with theater in the schools, social awareness, and a whole program around college scholarships. So each of those programs is going to have its own program budget as well. Now, inside each of those programs, there could be any number of projects or short-term activity groups, if you will, that would each have its own budget too. And because it's a community theater, you might think, for instance, that these would be the different theatrical productions that the community theater is putting on. So for instance, under social awareness program B, and I probably have slides for all of these that I'm forgetting to use. There we go. And there we go. Under program B, you'll see we've got three different projects going on right now that represent different dramatic productions that we're working on. Okay, now take a look at each of those three projects, which is going to have its own project budget. And you can see that we can break that one project out, Haley's story of a teen addict, for instance, right there in the middle, into proposals for three different funders. Way down there at the bottom, we've got a proposal for funder A, a proposal for funder B, and a proposal for funder XYZ. So we've got the overall annual organization budget. We have programmatic or initiative budgets. We've got project focused budgets. And for each project that we're seeking funding for, we can have any number of budgets that we're putting together specific to a given grant maker. Today, our focus is really going to be squarely on that budget right there in the middle, the project budget. We're really going to be focusing on how to use total value thinking to develop a budget that reflects the total value of everything it takes to do this one project successfully. But I have to tell you right now that the same principles that we're going to be packing into our project budget thinking will apply just as well at any level of budgeting in your organization. I just want to make it really clear that we're focusing on the project budget. And Haley's story of the teen addict is the actual real life scenario that we're going to be focusing on a little bit later on. So that is all by way of setting up the context. And now let's go ahead and dive into the planning tool that really is the heart of how to put together a total value budget. We call it the Master Budget Planning Checklist and Worksheet. It's a very big name, but it's a very, very simple and powerful tool. And I want to let you know why we do this. First of all, this is a worksheet slash checklist that minimizes the risk of forgetting something. Because it's a checklist, it has programmed into it the key budget items that you need to be thinking about whether or not they actually belong in a particular project budget. It provides a rock solid framework for project management, meaning that once you get the resources in place to do the work, this becomes your dashboard for actually managing the program resource plan moving forward. It also serves as a source document. What do I mean by source document? A source document means that you do all the work in one place with all the detail that you need, and then you can pull from that source document just what you need when you're putting a proposal together for funder A, just what you need when you're putting together a proposal for funder B, just what you need when you're putting a proposal, you see how that goes in the form and format that funder A, B, and XYZ need your proposal, but it's all coming from this document that you've already created independent of the form and format of any particular grant maker. And it is a total value budget. So let's talk about what total value means. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and show you what we call the basic version of the worksheet. Now, there's a much more detailed version we're going to be looking at in just a minute, but we're going to start simple. I don't want to overwhelm you and scare you with something that might look a little bit intimidating to begin with. The basic stripped down version looks just like this. Doesn't look too bad, does it? And here's what we see here. We see the first column is item or calculations, very typical for any budget form. And this is where you're listing out the specific things that you need to be including in your budget plan. That's what item means, right? Now, I want to let you know that the Master Budget Checklist and Worksheet is built around the same budget categories as major federal grants are. I cut my teeth way back when in federal proposal writing, so I know federal budget planning inside and out. And I like the categories that federal budgets typically use, federal proposals typically use in their budgets. So those are the same categories that we're using here, and we're going to be going through those categories one by one a little bit later. You can think about this list of items and calculations as your complete list of the ingredients, supplies, and equipment for your recipe. Did you notice that I used a chocolate chip cookie graphic there? Because I want you to be thinking about building your budget as if you are working with a recipe. And so the items and calculations is all about the complete list of everything you need to have on hand in order to successfully make a perfect batch of chocolate chip cookies. In the middle is what we call the total value line. And the question here is, what's the total value of everything you need to do the work? You've got all of your ingredients, all of your equipment, all of your supplies listed out. What would you have to pay if you were to pay full market price for everything on your list? That's what total value is. But out on the right-hand side, you can see that it's broken out into two additional columns. One is called match or source. And the way I really like to think about this is contributed value. Contributed value. Think of this in terms of the recipe as what's already in the pantry. What do you already have in your kitchen as you're setting out to make your chocolate chip cookies that you don't have to go to the store to get, or you can get it from a neighbor? So what does getting it from a neighbor mean? So it's either already in your pantry, meaning it's something your organization already has that you can put to work for this particular project, or you can, quote, get it from a neighbor, meaning you have a partner in the community who is ready and able to provide this resource to support this project. Okay, so that's contributed value. That's our match, and then source column simply means where does it come from. So the difference between the total value of everything it takes to do the work and what you already have in the pantry or can get from a neighbor is what? It's your shopping list. It's what you don't already have, and you need to go buy, if you will, from the grants store. All right, so that's the basic concept behind the total value budget. And let's go ahead and work through a couple of examples just to give you a feel for how to play this out. Okay, so let's just imagine that you're an organization that you are a wildlife refuge, for instance, and you need to expand one of your wildlife enclosures. And for that, you need to rent a post hole digger, this big piece of heavy duty equipment here. You're going to lease it for 5 days, and you know that it's going to cost $120 a day for the 5 days you're going to lease it. So you want to build this into a grant proposal. You're looking for money to support you in doing this. So the first question you always ask when you're doing total value budgeting is, what's the total value of this resource? Actually, the first question you ask when you're doing total value budgeting is this something that is necessary for the successful completion of the work we plan to do? Obviously, yes, we have to have a postal digger. We need to dig those fence holes, right? So the next question is, what's the total value? Well, we can make that calculation pretty quickly, can't we? 5 days at $120 a day. We're going to pop $600 right there in that total value column. But now the question becomes, how do we split that total value, that $600, between our match column and our grant column? Well, the question is this something that we already have, or is this something we need to go to the grants store to get? And in this case, this is something we want to build into a grant request. We are looking for grant dollars to pay the entire $600, and that means that none of that is coming from match. Okay, that's pretty simple and straightforward. Good job. So again, total value is the value of everything it takes, and then how does that divide out between what we already have or can get from our partners, contributed value, or what we need to get from grant dollars. So let's take a look at a different kind of example here. In this case, we're one of those organizations that works with doctors, surgeons, basically, who volunteer to go anywhere in the world to do craniofacial or maxillofacial reconstructive surgery, basically for small children who are born with cleft palate. We've all seen the ads on TV, and it's really wonderful work that they do. So let's just imagine for our purposes that in our budget, in our work plan, we are going to be having 100 hours of surgeon time for a particular project that we're involved with. And it's a volunteer surgeon. So the question is, number one, for our purposes of our total value budgeting, is this a resource that's necessary for the successful completion of this project? Heck yeah, the whole program is built around these surgeons, right? So this is a necessary ingredient for our recipe. But the question becomes, where do we put the total value? So these are volunteers. They're not going to get paid. There's no money that changes hand, but that doesn't matter. When we're looking at total value budgeting, that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is this a necessary ingredient? And if the answer is yes, what's the total value that ingredient contributes to our project? So how do we establish the total value of 100 hours of surgical expertise? Well, maybe you're familiar with the independent sector. Every year, the independent sector puts out a report that establishes what it calls the value of volunteer time. And it does this by surveying and creating an average of all paid occupations, non-managerial and non-agricultural, I think is the language that they actually use. They just released a couple of months ago their 2018 number, and they came up with their assessment of $24.69 an hour for volunteer time. So if we simply multiply that by 100 hours, we come up with a total value for our surgeons of $2,469. Do you see that? I have a better idea. Let's go to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Let's not do an average of all non-managerial, non-agricultural positions across the country in any given year. Let's see what the actual fair market value is. Let's see what we would be paying these people if we were paying them, because the value of their time doesn't change whether they're being paid or not. The value is exactly the same. And if we go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we'll see that for oral and maxillofacial surgeons, which is the job category we're looking at here, the average hourly wage as of, actually this is an updated figure, is $116.70. Do you see that? So let's pull that number forward, multiply that by 100 hours, and what do we get? Our total value is now $11,670. That's a considerable up from what we came up with if we were using the independent sector value, right? So the question is, how do we break that total value out between the two columns from this grant or match and source? Is this something we already have in our pantry, or is this something we need to go to the grant store to get? Well, actually, this is what we're getting from a neighbor. This is contributed value. So the entire value goes out in the match column. This is the value that is being contributed by these surgeons on a volunteer basis, and that means we have zero in the grant column. It all is part of our match. It's all part of our contributed value. Okay, so that's how that works. And I just wanted to pop this slide up here to show you the comparison between what happens if we're using the actual fair market compensation rate for surgeons versus if we just plug in the independent sector rate for the average value of volunteer time across the sector. Can you see that the total value that's reflected by using the fair market rate is 4.7 times what we would get if we simply plugged in the independent sector rate? In my world, there's no reason at all to use the independent sector rate. It's a matter of convenience, but it's not a matter of accuracy. And the total value budget, the way we teach it, is you will always look for the fair market value of every resource that you need in order to do the work that you're doing. Okay, so there you go with that. So there's the budget building proposal, budget form in the simplified version. Not too scary. Let's take a look at what it looks like when we give you the full-blown checklist. Now this becomes a checklist, and that means that even though you have the exact same budget categories, you see A, salaries, B, employee-related expenses, C, contractual services, etc., you also have plugged in under each of those a number of items that you might want to be specifically considering whether they need to be part of your budget as well. For instance, you have maybe executive director, maybe program project manager, maybe program staff. If it relates to your budget, keep it in and fill in the blanks. If it doesn't relate, cross it out. You don't need to use it. It's a checklist. Do we need this? Yes or no? And then we proceed from there. So the same exact setup, you've got the items and the calculations way over on the left-hand side. There's the calculations. You've got the total value right in the middle. And then out to the right-hand side, you have the same two column headings that we just looked at, our matching resources and our grant resources. And again, everything it's going to take to do the work, what we already have plus what we need to get, and it all equals that total value right there in the middle. Okay, so that's the basic setup of using the Master Budget Planning Checklist and Worksheet as a total value budget planning tool. Woo, okay. So what I want to do now is take us into a real life working scenario and give you a chance to see and actually practice, if you're really quick with your own calculator, how you can apply total value thinking to some scenarios that might come up in this mythical organization that we're working with called Youth Play. And again, we're not going to be addressing all the budget issues that come up in each of these budget categories, but I just want to give you a flavor for some of the things that you can be looking to as you start to use the total value budget thinking. So let's imagine that you're the grant professional for an organization called Youth Play. Youth Play is a nonprofit theater group, and of course, you're very, very good at your job. We have a program around social awareness. Remember, we saw that on that budget hierarchy chart that we looked at a few minutes ago. So one of our social awareness program, the theater wants to reach out and collaborate with the health and human services provider on a dramatic production with a strong message about a current current social issue. That's what our social awareness program is all about. So we develop a partnership with an organization called Been There. Been There is a teen substance abuse prevention group, and we arranged to create and perform a work called Haley, the story of a teen addict that shows the impact of a teen's meth addiction on her family, her friends, and her future. So in your workbook on page 10, there's more detail about the sort of backup detail information that you have about what this is going to look like in terms of the project plan, the work plan, who's involved, how many hours they're going to be devoting doing this, that, and the other. There's a filled in version of what this would look like in a total value budget on page 20 in your workbook, but please don't peek ahead. I want us to actually fill in the blanks ourselves and do the calculations as we move forward. And then you'll have that filled in version on page 20 in your workbook to reference, knowing that that's the correct answer, if you will. So with that in mind, let's move forward. Let's talk about the first category, salaries. When we're talking about salaries, again, remember we're tracking with the major budget categories in a typical federal budget. We're not talking about the budget categories that Funder A, Funder B, or Funder XYZ is giving us in their grant proposal form. We're developing something that is independent of any specific grant maker's form or format. And you'll see why that's important a little bit later on. So the underlying question that we're answering when we take a look at salaries is who will be investing their time and expertise on this project as staff members, and what's the value of that time? So for budgeting purposes, again, Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you need to know what the going rate is, for instance, for a position that you've never actually hired for before, a good place to start would be the Bureau of Labor Statistics, same link that we looked at for our volunteer surgeons. But let's just take a look at how this plays out in terms of Jen. Who is Jen? Jen is the artistic director. She's already on staff half-time at $30 an hour. And that $30 an hour half-time is already covered in Youth Play's annual operating budget. So she's already there doing work. She's working 20 hours a week, and she's being paid $30 an hour for that work. But now you have this new project that you want Jen to take on, and you plan for the grant to cover an extra 10 hours a week for Jen through the project period. She's good with that. She's ready to go 30 hours a week for this particular project. The question is, how are you going to reflect the value of Jen's time on the budget worksheet for this project? Well, again, first of all, the first question is, does this need to be part of our budget? Is Jen a necessary resource for the successful completion of this project? Heck yes, she's the artistic director. She's kind of in charge of the whole thing, isn't she? So given that, the question becomes, what's the total value of her time? What's the value of Jen's time? So if you got your calculators going, you can follow along with me. I'm going to move through here quickly, but the calculations basically is how much time is she devoting to the grant project, over how many weeks, and at what pay rate. So remember, we're talking about the grant project, and how many hours a week are we budgeting for the grant project? Only 10. That's over and above what she's already working. The work she's already doing doesn't relate to this grant, so it's not a part of our grant project budget, right? Over how many weeks? Well, on page 10, it says 36. So 10 hours a week times 36 weeks, and what's the pay rate? We've agreed we're going to continue to pay her $30 an hour. So this is just a simple mathematical multiplication. 10 hours a week times 36 weeks at $30 an hour is $10,800. The question is, where's that going to go on our total value budget? And the question there is this something that we're asking for the grant to pay, or are we getting this from somewhere else? And the question is, that becomes part of our grant resources. So the total value goes right there in the middle. You see where that arrow is? That's our total value. And then the 10,800 also goes all the way out there in the grants resources. We need to go to the grant store to get the money to pay Jen that extra 10 hours a week. And then what goes in the middle in terms of matching resources? In this case, nothing. Okay, that's pretty simple and straightforward, but let's mix it up a little bit now. And let's take a look at George. Who the heck is George? Well, he's the mental health professional from Been There, and he's going to spend about 200 hours total working on the project, developing mental health resource materials, making follow-up presentations to schools, and so on. Now, he's going to take this on as part of his regular work assignment with Been There. Okay, he's got time to do this as part of his regular job. And his salary at Been There is basically $23.03 an hour when you break it out to an hourly basis. So now, how are you going to, what is the total value of George's time? And how are you going to show this on your total value budget worksheet? Well, we go through the same exact process that we did with Jen, and we say how much time and how much is that time valued. So it's 200 hours total times $23.08 an hour. And that means the total value for this grant project is $4,616, right? Everybody get that? Now the question is, if that's the total value, then what does that look like in terms of match or grant? In other words, do we need to get grant dollars to pay for George's time, or is this contributed value? Well, here's what that looks like. There's our total value. There he is on that bottom line, mental health professional, $23.08 per hour times 200 hours for this project, $4,616 in total value. But this is contributed value from Been There, who's paying his salary while he does this work, and no part of this goes in the grants resource column. So you can see just from these two lines how you begin to build your totals in the grants column and the matching resources column, right? Okay, so nothing over there. All right, so that's a really good start on how to use this. And I'm going to go quickly through a couple more of the categories just to give you a quick touch and go, but then we've got a couple more examples I want you to be working through that are a little bit trickier than the one we just looked at. Category B is employee-related expenses. And the underlying question here is always, what other costs are associated with the personnel who'll be supporting this project? Now, this is a really big issue, and there are a lot of tricky, sticky bits. So we're not covering that here. There are lots of other great webinars and training resources for budgeting for employee-related expenses. The question that you would come up with here in terms of total value budget basically would be, what would make sense for including EREs in our real life scenario? Do we want to be including EREs for Jen for the additional time that she's working? Do we want to be including the EREs that George has as part of his work at Been There? What about volunteers? Well, there's a law of diminishing returns that might apply here. And it basically says, you know, when you start to talk about fractions of dollars, you might not actually be wanting to go to that level of detail. We've got a rule in the grantsmanship game called rule number 6, the rule of common sense. So as we're talking about the total value of everything it does to do the work, for instance, if does it actually make sense to do all the calculations to work out what EREs would attach to George's position for under $5,000? Maybe yes, maybe no. That's a judgment call that you'll need to make, but the rule of common sense definitely applies there. Now, if we were talking about calculations for a grant to cover EREs, then you definitely want to be very clear and specific in the dollar amounts and the calculations. And again, that's way beyond what we can cover here. But I just want to put the question mark in your mind to think about what actually does make sense in terms of EREs when it comes to total value budgeting. Contractual services, our third category. What outside expertise or labor will you need to engage via contract for this project? People that wouldn't be working for your organization if you weren't doing this specific project. So some typical categories here would be a third-party evaluation, independent audit, any kind of professional consulting, skilled or unskilled labor. And for most of your volunteers, I'm thinking this is probably where your volunteers are best best going to fit into your budget and resource planning. What about volunteers? Well, let's take a look at our example for Been There. No, for youth play. So in our scenario, we have two parents who are theater professionals, and they volunteered to do the costume and stage set design. This is what they do for their work, and they're happy to do this for our production here. They're figuring this is going to require about 100 hours total time over a 2-month period. So the question is it appropriate to include these parents as contractors on our total value budget? And if so, how's this going to show up on our budget worksheet? Well, as always, the first question for total value budgeting is this a resource that's necessary to successfully do the work we're setting out to do? Do we need to have someone do the costume and stage set design? Yes. Okay, so we know they're going to show up on the budget worksheet. Let's talk through how that's going to work. What do we need to know? Well, we need to know two things. We need to know the total amount of time they're going to spend, and we need to know the fair market value of that time. Well, we know the total amount of time is 100 hours, but we don't know the fair market value. So one way to find out the fair market value would be what? Go back to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Woohoo! And it's very, very simple. When you go to the website, it's really simple to drill down to find the specific position that you want to be researching. So we find set and exhibit designers. That's perfect match for what we're looking at here. And we see that the average hourly wage for set and exhibit designers is $26.40. That's the fair market value for the work that these parents are going to be doing. Whether we were paying them or not, that value doesn't change. The only thing that changes is whether that is something we need grant dollars to cover or something that goes in our contributed value column. And I think I just gave you the answer to the next question, so we can do that calculation. Okay, 2640 times what? 100 hours equals $2,640. And that goes in our match column. As volunteers, this is the contributed value of the time that they're bringing to the project. There you go, the theater pros. So our match column is really building, isn't it? So again, there's total value right in the middle. And there's our match amount. You can see the source is volunteers, and 0 goes in the grants column. All right. How'd that work? How are you doing with that? Space costs. I've got one that's a little bit trickier for you on this one. Space costs is all about what's the cost or value of the physical space that's going to be committed to or used by the project. Basic categories you're going to be looking at is any costs associated with your office, rent, lease, or mortgage, any other space you might be using, and also custodial and maintenance costs, utilities costs, donated space, anything that might be involved in renovating that space. And there's a little note down there at the bottom about indirect cost recovery. Stay tuned. We're going to be talking about that later on, the whole idea of indirect costs. So here's an interesting little puzzle for you in our real life scenario about our performance rehearsal space. All of our rehearsals take place at a nearby high school, which has agreed to rent its stage to us for rehearsals for $30 an hour. Okay, you're figuring about 25 hours of rehearsal time for this project. But you also know that they're giving you a discounted rate that full market for this rehearsal space is $100 an hour. So how will you reflect the value of this rehearsal space on your budget worksheet? First of all, does it have value? Is it a necessary resource for your project? Yes. Okay, what's the value of that resource in terms of time, in terms of money? So there's a little bit of a twist in this one that you might not have seen coming, and that's the fact that you have your out-of-pocket cost of $30 an hour, but you also know that that doesn't reflect the fair market rate for this rehearsal space. So let's take a look at what we can do about that, because I think this is a way that we dramatically undervalue the resources that we put to work to do the work that we're doing. We know that there's 25 hours of rehearsal time, and we know that's going to cost us $30 an hour. So there's actual out-of-pocket cost for us. But we also know that the market value is $100 an hour. So is this going to show up as match, or is it going to show up as grant? Well, let's just work that through together here. Our actual out-of-pocket cost of 25 hours, $30 an hour is $750. We need to get $750 through a grant because that is money that needs to come out of our pocket to pay the high school for that rehearsal space. But is that the full value of that rehearsal space? And the answer is no. That's the discounted value of that rehearsal space, because we also have a market value of $100 an hour. So the full value of the space is $100 an hour, or $2,500 total. Now what do we do? Well, the total value is what? $2,500. And what do we do with the $750? That's what we need to get from the grant. Let's take a look at that. There's our $2,500 total value. There's what we need to get from the grant, the $750. The difference between the two is the discount that we're getting from ABC High School of $1,750. That's contributed value. That's contributed value. And that's something that we don't always think to include when we're putting a budget together, but it's absolutely essential in total value budgeting. Again, that we think about, if we were paying full market price, what would that price be? And what are we actually paying? Right? So I'll let you sit with that a little bit. Think about contributed value versus full market value versus what we need out of pocket to get a grant to cover. Tricky, huh? All right, well, we're going to move through the next category. That was our last exercise. We're going to move through the next categories pretty quickly. Equipment, E, rental, lease, or purchase, anything it takes by way of office furniture, office equipment, AV equipment, for instance, anything with construction or maintenance or any other kind of equipment. Hang on one second, I need to grab a drink. Okay. And equipment, again, there's a lot that goes into budgeting and valuing equipment and what qualifies as equipment and what limitations do funders place on equipment. Again, way beyond the scope of what we're looking at doing here. But I want to, in a fair market, from a total value framework, to remind you that if you're bringing equipment that you already own or have control of into this project, if you're repurposing equipment that you already have access to for this project, remember to include the value of that equipment as well, because if you didn't already have it, you would have to pay for it. And so the value of having that equipment needs to be part of your total value budget. About supplies and materials. What are the consumables that are necessary to support this project? Office supplies, participant materials and supplies, copying supplies, books, publications, everything in our scenario for the theatrical production that has to do with costuming supplies and, set design supplies and paint and all of those good things. So really, really, really go deep and think through very carefully what are all the things that need to be in place for you to actually do this work successfully. And there are lots of in-kind donation possibilities here in the supplies and materials category, ways that you can go to local businesses, for instance, and ask if they're willing to donate the lumber for your set construction or the fabric for your costumes, or your local thrift stores maybe donating costume jewelry for some of the costuming pieces. There are lots of ways that you can think about in-kind donation possibilities that all belong on the total value budget as what? Contributed value. Okay, you're catching on here. Travel. This breaks down into two different areas. Out of area travel. So if you're flying to a conference across the country, you've got all your transportation, lodging, and meals costs to budget in. That also includes local mileage. If you're reimbursing staff and or volunteers, I'm sorry, my throat is so dry, and or volunteers for the use of their personal vehicles, how are you going to include that in your budget? Okay, so let's talk about that for just a minute, because this is an area where volunteers often get shorted, and they shouldn't be. If we're taking our total value thinking to a very mindful level, we probably all know that the IRS has set a rate every year. It sets a rate of deductible expenses for work-related use of personal vehicles. So if you are driving your personal vehicle for work, the IRS says that on your tax filings you can deduct 54.5 cents per mile for that purpose. That has also been adopted by most jurisdictions as the rate at which they will reimburse you for use of your personal vehicle. Okay, you can't do both. You can't take it as a tax deduction and be reimbursed for it, but that is typically set as the reimbursement rate as well. So that's what you would want to budget in if that was going to be part of your budgeting. But what about volunteers? If volunteers are using their personal vehicle for work related, for their travel related to their volunteer work, how might you reflect that on your total value budget? Well, it's really interesting because there's so much confusion about this. The IRS also gives volunteers the opportunity to deduct something for their personal vehicle use related to their volunteer service, but theirs is limited to 14 cents per mile. That's the deductible rate, but that is not a reimbursement rate. So many organizations say, sorry, we can reimburse our staff 54.5 cents per mile, but the IRS says we can only reimburse volunteers, if you reimburse them at all, at 14 cents a mile. That's nonsense. That's absolutely not true. That is, to the very best of my understanding, not at all what the IRS is saying. The IRS is not controlling the reimbursement rates. That's something we set ourselves. And why is a mile driven by a staff person for work-related purposes worth more than a mile driven by somebody also doing work for the organization who's not being compensated for that work? It's not. The value of the use of personal vehicle is exactly the same whether the person using the personal vehicle for work is being paid or is a volunteer. So that's my little volunteer stump, is if you're going to be reimbursing volunteers, please reimburse them at the same rate that you're reimbursing your paid staff. Okay, phew. Category H, building costs. I know I'm going to get questions about that one here. Is your project a capital or bricks and mortar project that's going to include building costs? And here's some examples of things that you'll be thinking about building into your budget if that's the case. Again, a lot of detail and a lot of considerations for building budgets around capital or bricks and mortar projects. Just wanted to make sure you know that's here as a category. And then finally, the federal budgeting process gives us this junk drawer category called other expenses. And this is where you go back to your detailed project work plan and you just simply brainstorm what else needs to be in place in order for us to be successful in doing this work. And so here's a list of some things that typically don't show up in the other categories that you might want to consider. A big one, for instance, is training expenses. Sometimes you might leave training expenses off the budget completely and then discover that with a whole crop of new staff people coming on board, you actually need to pay to train them. So if that's not part of your budget, you're going to have to find those training resources from someplace else. And that's the value of having a checklist form like the one that we're working with here, is it prompts you to think, do we have training costs associated with this? Do we have any advertising and marketing costs associated with this? So those prompts help to make sure that you don't leave anything out that is a necessary ingredient. All right, well, that brings us through all of the budget categories, and we're going to continue on moving out of the categories to talk a little bit more about some other things you need to know to really put this total value budget thinking to work. And I'm going to have to go super quick. I can see, I was afraid that might happen, Tammy. I really am moving quickly. It's all about what are we planning to do and what will we need to do that work. And I want to let you know something I call the ABC equals 1, 2, 3 model. The way that funders read your proposal is many funders go to the budget first because that's where they can best get a quick sense of the overall picture of what you're setting out to do and what the resources are that need to be in place in order to do that work. ABC equals 1, 2, 3 means that for every single item in your narrative, there needs to be a corresponding item in your budget that shows how that work is going to be supported. And for every single item in your budget, there needs to be a clear explanation in your narrative, the A side, of how that resource is going to contribute to the success success of your project. So you want to make sure that these are mirror images. The narrative and the budgets are lining up, and there's a clear one-to-one correspondence between the two, because funders will look at an overlap, a gap, or a mismatch and question the strength of the planning that went behind that if they see that there's something that's misaligned between the two. Just a little pointer I thought I'd share. Direct and indirect costs. Oh my gosh, let's talk about direct and indirect costs here. Direct costs are those items that can be directly attributed only to this specific project, service, or program. If you weren't offering this project or service, you would not be incurring these costs. Going back to the recipe analogy, these are recipe-specific ingredients. These are things you would not have around if you weren't making chocolate chip cookies. Chocolate chips would be a good example of that, perhaps. And maybe you don't keep butter around unless you're baking. Maybe you don't keep eggs around unless you're baking. These are specific to this recipe. Indirect costs, on the other hand, are things that you have to keep your doors open. They're not specific to any one program or service, but they support everything that the agency is doing. These are kitchen staples or kitchen equipment. This is like the oven or the mixing bowl or, maybe flour. These are things that you have on hand for lots of different recipes that you're cooking up, not just the chocolate chip cookies. Now, this is a really interesting terminology. This used to be called overhead. When I started working, this was overhead, and then it became administrative costs. And now it's indirect costs, and now indirect is starting to take on a tainted feel. It's like it all feels like it's not really necessary. And there's a ton of debate going on. Maybe you've seen some of it, and I can give you resources to tap you into it about how to find language, find language that more clearly expresses the centrality of these resources in terms of we have to have them in order to do our work. I like the term infrastructure costs, but there's a whole movement to actually shift to thinking to consider these as core mission support. And you'll be able to link into the blog article that you see the link to on your screen here. You probably won't have time to write the whole thing down. You can just Google core mission support, and you'll come up with some really, really great articles that have been showing up in the last couple of years about how to graphically revision the central importance of what we now call indirect costs. From a standpoint of total value budgets, you probably know that many funders either don't allow their grants to cover quote unquote indirect costs. Maybe they will support infrastructure costs or core mission support costs. Maybe changing the language will change the way they think. But if there's a limit or a cap on indirect cost coverage, does that mean that you can't reflect the total value of your indirect costs in your budget? And the answer is absolutely not, because you can build the value of the indirect costs that the grant won't cover as project match. It's contributed value. It has value. It's a necessary part of the project's success. And you can build that value in the match column because the grant's not going to cover it. Think about that for a little bit. Okay, something else I'm going to get questions about. And here's what I kind of want to just really want to make sure you see this. Let's talk about how total value thinking impacts our direct versus indirect cost ratio. So let's say, for instance, and many of you are aware of this, that there's just a lot of conversation out there about how much of our dollar is going to support indirect costs and how much is going to support direct program services. And so you look at an organization's budget, and those that are paying more than 20% of their total budget to support those core mission support costs or indirect costs are sort of frowned on. And those that are under 8% are like, oh, they're lean and mean. Well, they're not lean and mean, they're starving. That simply means they simply do not have enough financial support for their core mission support. But those numbers are really deceptive, and a lot of times those numbers can be dramatically shifted if we are in fact looking at the total value of all the contributed value in our organization. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. Let's say that you've all of your direct support is provided by those wonderful surgeons, and they're volunteers. So you don't need to budget any cash at all for those volunteers. All of your cash, in fact, goes to support your admin costs. That's $100,000. Let's just say $100,000. And I've got to move some things around on my screen because I can't see. There we go. And that means that your indirect cost ratio was 100%. 100% of your total organization budget is supporting quote unquote indirect costs. And that's because we're not assigning any value at all in our budget to the surgeons who provide 100% of our direct services. So instead, let's go, once again, I'm having a little trouble with my slide advances. Every time I move something on my screen, there we go. Instead, let's go with minimum wage. Let's see if we valued our surgeons at minimum wage, $11 an hour. Okay, that means that their value would be $44,000 on our budget. And that automatically bumps our indirect ratio down from 100% to 69%. Now only 69% of our total budget is going to support indirect costs. That's a terribly high percentage, and it's not accurate because if we go to the independent sector ratio of $24.69, when we plug that number in instead, our indirect ratio now goes down to 51%. I hope you can follow how that works. But guess what, guys? We're still not valuing our surgeons' contributions accurately until we actually go to total value market rate of $116.70. Now that bumps the total value of their services up to almost $500,000. And when we do all the calculations together, we can see the indirect ratio out at on the right-hand side turns out to be 18%, as opposed to 100% if we're not including the value of their time in the budget at all. So just use that as an extrapolation and an example, and imagine what might happen to the indirect ratio in your organization if your budgeting reflected the total value of everything it took to do the work you're doing, whether it was coming from cash or non-cash, whether it was coming from grant or contributed resources. All right, so the question came up about using the Common Grant application, and I want to let you know that the form that you are given by any specific grant maker to compile the budget for your proposal is not the same form you should use to plan your budget. Here's an example of the Common Grant application sample foundation budget form. And you can take a quick look at this. This is all you're given by way of guidance for creating a budget to submit to this particular funder. How effective is this form for planning your proposal budget? Not at all. The grant maker's proposal budget form is a reporting tool. That's the tool that they're asking you to use to report to them the front end of all of your back end budget planning. The planning needs to happen with a planning tool, and that's exactly what our budget planning checklist and worksheet is. It is the planning tool that you use to lay this all out as your source document, and then you pull from it to give the funders exactly what they're looking for in the form and format that they're asking you to submit as a reporting tool. Okay, so there's a big pitch on that. Total value, why it matters. Funders call it match, and you can see how the match column begins to build when we're fairly valuing the total value of everything it takes to do our work. It shows the actual accurate balance between direct and indirect costs, just as we looked at with our maxillofacial surgeons just a moment ago. It shows everything it takes to do our work in the community, and it builds an accurate picture of the tremendous economic power of our sector. Did you know that the nonprofit sector contributes over $900 billion a year to the U.S. economy? That's over 5% of this country's gross domestic product, and that's cash value only. That does not even include contributed value. So we are not wimps, guys. We are not beggars. We are out there contributing, and I want you to take the Grants Magic U Total Value Pledge and raise your right hand and say, I hereby solemnly pledge that I will never, ever again understate the total value of everything it takes to do our mission critical work in the world. Because if we're not showing the total value of everything it takes to do our work, how will the people that we're counting on to support us in that work ever know what it really takes to do that work? So here we go. We've just raced right through a tremendous amount of information. We're ready to go back to the questions on page 4 now at the end of our session and see if your answers might have changed or your thinking might have deepened around the questions that we're talking about here. In-kind contributions and volunteer services have to be in our proposal budgets as part of our total value budget thinking. Whether they involve actual expenditures of grant dollars or not, they are necessary resources for us to successfully do our work. And the same thing is true of what we're calling indirect costs. That's question number 2. They need to be part of the project budget planning, whether funders will allow their grant dollars to be used to cover them or not. And now we know that we need a planning form when we are planning our budget and a reporting form when we are reporting our budget, and never the twain shall meet. So great big no's on all of those, false all the way through. So what I would love to do, as we're going to wrap up here really, really quickly, is think of one action you can take right away based on something that came up for you during this really rapid fire hour that you can do right away to give you a quick win, some idea, some step that you can take without having to ask permission from anybody at all that will give you a quick success. Put in action something that you learned here, because that's what's going to make this learning stick for you. But I also want to challenge you to come up with one action you can take soon that's going to give you high leverage, that's going to move the dial in some big way in your organization around these issues. These are huge issues that we've been addressing, and we've been trying to address them in a very practical way, but they're gigantic issues. So there's something here that will really move the dial for you, for your organization, maybe for your community as a whole. And then go ahead and make a plan for how you're going to take those actions and really do that. Put what you learn here into practice just as soon as you possibly can. And this is the place where I get to stop and take a breath and say, wow, thanks for hanging in there, guys. We went about 5 minutes over our time so far. If you need to leave, please don't worry about that, because we're going to stay on and handle some questions. But don't worry, it's all going to be on the replay as well. And so I just posted on the screen there some guidelines for your questions if you haven't put them in already. And I'm going to turn things over to you, Tammy, and leave this screen up here while people while we're looking at the questions that we've got. Oh my gosh, I feel like I've been racing.
Yes, take a breath. Take a breath. You've covered so much material, and we really appreciate this. So if you've asked a question we haven't gotten to yet, please put it into questions, but also look at her email there. If it's something that's best, one-off, sent to her, feel free to do that. But like I said, we're going to compile all these questions that have come in and write a blog on the most common questions that complement the material you've listened to. So if you need to leave now, please fill out the exit survey. We love to get your input, and we want to see and what you want to see on future webinars. We have our next webinar coming up next month. It's already available on our website to register. We've got project management skills, guide star, panel of funders, very interesting topics coming up. So Maren, let's jump back to some questions.
Sure.
And look at what we have here. If the grant maker says just to include a project budget or include an organizational budget with no other guidance on how much detail do they want, should we include planned income or just expenses? What are they really asking for? And also there's other questions similar to this that are, what if the funder doesn't allow me to attach a total value budget? And I think you spoke to using a planning tool versus the reporting tool. So maybe if you highlight, how you could use this total value.
So when a fund, I'll take that. The first question I'll be happy to take up, but it's not quite on topic with the total value budget. That goes back the distinction between an organizational budget and a project budget, and the budget hierarchy that we looked at, and questions of expenses versus revenues. And that's a great budget related question is just, I don't think it's quite a fit for total value. So let's set that and we'll address
Okay.
that one in
Okay.
the vlog, okay? Um, Many funders simply don't have any format for you to clearly include the information that we're talking about here in total value. And what I didn't talk about, so that would, for instance, they wouldn't necessarily have a space where you could put the value of your volunteer time, which is a shame. They don't necessarily allow you to do that as part of the budget form. If you can add a line, do it. And if that line is just simply contributed value, and then you're including in that contributed value everything that you don't have space to break it out, that's completely fine. You can also include that in the narrative. If there's a budget narrative or where there's a line somewhere in your narrative, just a simple sentence or two that says, our total budget request of $25,000 is leveraged by an additional $75,221 in contributed value. Most of this comes from our volunteers, but a portion of it is, contributed space and equipment from our partners in the community. So something even as simple as that can really show that that $25,000 grant request is being leveraged on the back end by, at a 3-to-1 rate, and that the total thing really costs $100,000. So there's that. And that's a great question. That's something I can take up on the blog as well, a little bit more about how do you do your very best to reflect total value given the budget forms that funders ask us to use. I love that question.
Great. Here's another question. On the Bureau of Labor Statistics, should you use the state amount if it's available or federal if both are available?
Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is great because it breaks everything down by region, and that includes state, sometimes all the way down to metropolitan area, industry, and the specific position title within the industry. So yeah, if you're looking for a budget for a particular geographic focus, you can use the specific number. They don't have state versus federal as far as I know. The link that I shared here takes you straight to the entire index that is, it's indexed by geographic area, like I said, even right down to the metropolitan area, industry and specific position. It's not government. These are not government figures. These are actual on the ground compensation rates for particular positions in particular industries in particular parts of the country.
Man, we just have a lot of questions coming here.
I knew we would. I told you. I told you we would.
Oh, I could answer one. What are FTEs? That's full-time equivalents.
Yes. That flashed up on the screen, didn't it? So that's federal talk for the equivalent of a 40-hour-a-week position, full-time equivalent. So a 2.0 FTE would be 80 hours a week, whether that's 2 full-time people or 4 half-time people, it still adds up to 80 hours a week. Yeah.
Someone also asked, what if staff is not being paid fair market value, but they're actually being paid a lower rate? Are there any considerations there?
I love that question. I haven't really grappled with that, but it's a fabulous total value budget question, isn't it, Tammy?
Yeah.
If you're working for half of what you should be being paid, you're contributing a ton of value. If you're working as a complete volunteer, then your total value is what you should be getting, what the fair market rate would be. But if you're working for half of what you would be getting fair market value, I think it makes perfect sense to own the fact that this person is contributing the difference between fair market value for that position and what they're actually being compensated at.
Okay, great. And
because otherwise, how will anybody out there know that we're underpaying our staff?
Exactly. Yes. And somebody else also had a question related to that on if somebody's not actually an employee, but more as a mentor. and you're going to try to reflect a professional's time, but
Hmm.
they are acting as a mentor rather than doing the work themselves.
Well, you might
I
just
don't,
think creatively about if you were hiring someone to do that kind of thing, what might their job title or position be? And just be kind of creative about, was this a teacher, a tutor, a coach, an executive assistant? I don't know. But that's always the question, is if we were paying this person to do this, what would we be looking to hire?
okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's answer a few more questions here. We're coming up on
Yay.
15 minutes. Um, uh, when calculating staff required to carry out scope of work outlined in a proposal, do you include supervisors of the actual individual performing the work?
Well, let's just go back to the way we think about the total value budget. The first question we ask when we're considering total value is this something that's necessary for the successful completion of the work? If supervision is necessary for the successful completion of this work, then that supervision has value to the project and should be reflected on the total value budget. Whether that becomes contributed value or whether that's something that you recoup through a grant request, that's the decision that needs to be made. But if that work couldn't be successfully completed without it, then it's part of the ingredient list for the total project.
Yes. Yes. Um, I'm looking through these to find the ones that apply best to get a good
Mhm.
last question. Um, how about managing? Do you have any tips or thoughts in managing budgeting and funding that comes in different cycles? So the budget, the scope of the project changes throughout the years.
That's a cash flow issue, and I don't really have the expertise to tackle that. But you have great webinars from time to time, and maybe in your archives you have webinars that address the financial management topics. Am I right about that, Tammy?
Yes, and we have that as a suggestion for future webinars too. So if that's
Good.
something that people want to hear more of, put that in the post webinar survey.
Because that's a big deal.
Okay.
I mean, because budget is a
Yeah.
static picture. Budget doesn't tell anything about when the cash is coming in or when it's going out. I had this issue come up in a different context just yesterday, where an organization was just about to go under because even though their budget balanced for the year, none of the cash was due to come in until the end of the year. So cash
Yeah.
flow planning and budget planning are two separate but related processes, but they both need to be tended to.
All right, Maren, on the
Yay.
rest of the questions, I see many of them are similar, but just have a different, like
Okay.
I'm looking at electrical or executive
Oh, yeah.
director or a board member. So I'm going to
Yep.
let you look
Yep.
at all of them, combine them, and maybe you
Perfect.
could answer them all at once in a way that really helps people, as well as point to other resources, because there
Yeah.
are some good questions there. So thank you so much, Maren. We're getting lots of thanks from people that are, as they leave the webinar, these are some great tips and advice. And you're right. The work that people do should not be undervalued, and
Ever,
reflecting
ever,
that
ever, ever.
appropriately really helps educate the funders and show that you are doing so much, and how their contribution helps the whole work, and that overhead is not applicable. So thank you everyone for attending. We hope that you've enjoyed today's topic and you all have amazing success in your fundraising efforts and can write powerful budgets now. And Maren, if you have any closing remarks, go ahead and chime in, and then we'll close it down.
Well, I will just say, please take the total value budget pledge, because guys, now more than ever, we absolutely cannot afford ever to undervalue and understate what it takes to do our work. Our work is more important now than it's ever been in my lifetime, and it's going to continue to be that way. And so we need to stand strong and to be a strong voice for the nonprofits and the critical, mission critical work that we're doing. This is one way that we can shift the conversation and make a positive difference in the future. So thank you so much for hanging in there with me. It's certainly my pleasure, my delight, and my honor.
Great. Thank you, Marion. So you've given us a lot of tactical advice as well as strategic how we impact the sector. So we really
Yay.
appreciate that. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
I'll look
Tammy.
forward to having you on future webinars too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.